Some of you tell me if you've ever had this experience. If you're a big book reader, you may have had this happen to you. You have a book that you have read, or maybe a book series that you've read that you've loved, and then you hear that they're making that book into a movie. And maybe you initially get excited about that, and you're like, all right, I've loved this book, it's going to be a movie, but then you stop and think, oh, wait a minute. I really hope they don't ruin it. And then you go to see it, and sure enough, they've butchered your beloved book. This happened to me recently. There's a series of books that I have enjoyed reading. It's the Jack Reacher series of books. There's like 30 books at this point. I don't know if you've ever read these books, but one of the main sort of biggest pieces of the story has to do with Jack Reacher as a character is his size. They make it like a big plot point of the book. So he's described in these books as being 6'5", 250 pounds. They describe him as having a 50-inch chest. And his hands, depending upon the book that you read, are described as either being the size of dinner plates or supermarket chickens, is the size that they're described. So the whole point is that he's a physically intimidating presence. So when he walks into a room, he's the kind of guy, when he walks in the room, people are turn and look at him, look, who is this monster that has just walked into this room? That's kind of he kind of sets the scene when he walks into a room. So how do you think fans of the books felt when in 2012, the movie Jack Reacher was released, starring Tom Cruise? Now, I don't know if you know much about the physical dimensions of Tom Cruise, but he's not 6'5". He's 5'7". And they make him look taller in the movies, but not 6'5". And he's not 250 pounds. He weighs maybe 160 pounds. So immediately, fans of the Jack Reacher books are up in arms, and they're like, this guy is not Jack Reacher. And if you've got a favorite book where you've read and this has happened, you might have had this happen, something like this happen. But even worse, though, when this experience is happening to you, is then you talk to somebody who they've seen the movie and they haven't read the books, right? And they come to you and they're like, I love that movie, it was great. And you're like, oh, come on. You don't even know. You don't even know what this was supposed to be. They don't have the original source material, right, to compare the movie to. But that's the question that always comes down to when a book becomes a movie is what is it? What becomes the thing? What is the authoritative thing that gets to define what the authoritative story is when a book becomes a movie? And as we've been working our way through our series that has been entitled The Way of Wisdom, which we've been working our way through the book of Proverbs in order to learn how to walk in the way of wisdom that is ultimately embodied in the life of Jesus. And it's this dynamic that we're going to be talking about. And it's a dynamic that plays itself out in so many of the ways that we live in the world. Which, when we think real, true wisdom being the book, quote unquote, and our particular experience maybe that we have in life being the movie. And we make a choice about, am I going to use the book of wisdom to assess and evaluate the movie of my experience, or am I going to use experiences to assess and evaluate what presents itself to me as wisdom? So as we head into week 8 of the series, we're going to be exploring how this dynamic plays itself out in the area of our friendships. And as we think through this, the big idea that we're going to be exploring this morning is that wisdom will form our friendships, or friendships will form our wisdom. One of these things is going to become the lens with which we evaluate the other. We're either going to evaluate we'll either use wisdom in evaluating the way we form friendships and how we operate within them, or our friendships are going to form the lens with which we evaluate what is presented to us as wisdom. But regardless though of which order we go with that, one thing is true: friendships still are going to have a formative impact on us. When it comes to the formative power of friendships in our lives, it's not really a question of if. It's more a question of when and how. The people that we surround ourselves with, they just begin to shape us. It just happens. This starts with the very first people that we have relationships with, our immediate family. When our kids were very little, Anna, when she was very little, and I got permission before sharing this story, just so you know, when she was very little, I can't remember how old, like maybe 3 or 4. She hadn't been talking a lot. I mean, she was just at the very beginning of like using full sentences and things like that. But she would have this phrase would be on the beginning of every sentence that she would say to us. No matter what it was that she would say to us, she would say, "Just so you know." Like at the beginning of every sentence. So it would be like, she'd be like, "Just so you know, I'm coloring." And we're like, "All right." Or she'd be like, "Just so you know, I want a banana." And it'd be like, and we're like, "All right, like, why is she saying this?" And we, like, Helen and I would like, why does she always tell us, like, "Just so you know, I'm doing this. Just so you know, I'm doing that." Until one day, sitting at the table, Cal is getting ready. She's going to the store, and she looks at me. She says, "Just so you know, I'm going to the store." And I stopped. And I said, "It's you. You're the reason why she says this all the time." And it's just like, this simple little, like just a few words that just got adopted into our language. It starts when we're young, and it doesn't stop. We're formed by our first relationships in our families, and we continue to be formed as we start to build relationships outside of our families with our friends. And that's why the book of Proverbs has so many words of caution and instruction around the formative power of friendships. And here's just a few examples. Proverbs 13, verse 20, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." And then in Proverbs 22, "Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared." And then on the positive side, Proverbs 27, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." So for good, for bad, the people that we surround ourselves with have a formative effect on us. And it happens in a variety of ways. One example, friends have a role in shaping our behavior. And I'm sure many of us have seen this happen in our lives with ourselves or others. We see people, or we see a group of people, they start to spend a lot of time together, and they start to develop some shared behaviors around things like language or common interests or humor or activities. With an example of this in my own house. So most of you know, I grew up in Connecticut. So if you're from Connecticut and you're a sports fan, in general, you are a fan of either Boston teams or you are a fan of New York teams, because we're that weird New England state where we don't really know what we are. So you're either a fan of Boston teams or you're a fan of New York teams, kind of depending upon where you live in the state. So I live pretty much smack dab in the middle of the state. So we were right on the line where you were either a Red Sox, Patriots, Celtics fan, or you were a Yankees, Giants, Knicks fan. And I mean, there were occasionally like oddball Mets and Jets fans, but we don't really talk about them that much. Sorry, Rodriguez, if you're here, but But then you have my brother, who he was not a Boston fan. He was not a New York fan. He was a Detroit sports fan. Detroit. Tigers, Lions, Pistons. That was my brother's teams. Did we ever live in Detroit or Michigan? No. Do we have any familial connection to Detroit or Michigan? No. We've never even been there for like what I could remember of my early life. But one of his best friends growing up was from Michigan, was a big Detroit sports fan, and my brother adopted those teams. And to this day, He's 4 years older than me. He loves Detroit sports teams. And now he finally gets to celebrate some Lions success after many, many years of not great. But which sports teams we choose, it's not exactly a very significant behavior, but it's a small example of the bigger truth that Proverbs points to when it says things like when he says, do not make friends with a hot-tempered person, or you might learn your ways and get yourself ensnared. Because what we practice together, even if it's just cheering for the same team, forms habits. And habits shape the way we act in more significant areas, like things like, what is the language that we find appropriate to use in just our everyday life? Or what are the norms in how we treat other people? Or how do we spend our money? Or how do we respond when we encounter difficulty, or we get upset, or we're in the midst of a struggle? Our friendships have a significant role in forming these behaviors. And it's not that it happens overnight, and most of the time it kind of happens slowly as people get increasingly comfortable with one another. But it's also not just what we do that gets shaped. It's also how we think and what we believe about what we do, as friendships also begin to shape our values and our beliefs. Think about your life and think about the things that are important to you today. Can you think of something that is important to you today because it was important to somebody else at some point in your life that was important to you? Like maybe you started making exercise a priority because it was a priority to someone else in your life. Or maybe you find yourself becoming more politically interested or invested because somebody in your life you started to connect with somebody who had that passion about politics. Just a couple of weeks ago, our Belize team, we got back from our mission trip serving with Bold Hope. And that was Grace's 5th mission trip with Bold Hope over the last 10 years. And that partnership that Grace has with Bold Hope actually began here at Grace through a friendship of mine. Some of you may remember Vince Caparelli. We met maybe 12 years ago now while I was working at Access. And, this was before he would actually start attending Grace at one point, but this was before he actually started attending Grace. He went on staff with Bold Hope, which was then called Poverty Resolutions. And through our friendship, he would talk to me all of the time about, and they were primarily working in Haiti at that time. He would talk to me all of the time about the work and the mission and the vision of the organization and what they were doing in Haiti. And through that relationship, we at Grace began to explore that partnership. And now 10 years later, here we are. And God used a single friendship to bring about this entire missions impact of Grace's partnership with Bold Hope over the last 10 years. And you're likely here in this room today because of a relationship, maybe with a friend, maybe with a family member. And the thing is, we tend to think that we arrive at our beliefs and our values in isolation, when the truth is a lot of what we believe is formed in us through relationships with people that we trust. And just like friendships can form our values and beliefs, they can also erode them. When we find ourselves in friendships or relationships where our values and beliefs just aren't respected. And what do you do in those situations? And we'll talk about that in just a little bit later. But lastly, friendships form our perceptions of ourselves and the world. Friendships don't just form the way we act in the world and the way we believe in the world. They can form the way we see ourselves within it. Take two people, similar intelligence, skill, ability, resources. You surround one person with people who encourage them. They see their potential. They challenge them constructively. They want what's best for them. They cheer them on. They believe that God is at work in them. They believe that God is going to accomplish great things for them. They say things to this person like, I think you could do that. I believe in you. Have you considered going for it? God's clearly gifted you in this area. I think you should try. Or when they face setbacks, they say, that was really tough, but I believe that you could bounce back from that. And then you surround the other person with people who maybe only see that relationship as, for what they can get out of it. And they're not really overly concerned with what's best for the other person. And they don't really care that much about their potential. In fact, they discourage it. And they more see themselves as helpless victims of circumstance in life. And they talk to the other person that in the way that they should feel the same way. And they say things like, why bother? Why bother even trying? I mean, nothing ever changes anyway. Or that's not really your thing. I think you're just going to get frustrated if you do that. You should just, don't even bother. Or people like us, we don't get those kind of breaks. Things like that don't work out for us. Which of these people is likely to have a hopeful, optimistic outlook on life? And to believe that God is going to be at work in their future? And to believe that they could have a significant role and what they do might actually impact the world around them. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, right? If we have friendships with people who believe that God is at work in us, and believe that God will be at work through us, and they're excited to see what God will do in us, that's huge. As opposed to people who don't see much hope for themselves and, by extension, us. This is exactly what Proverbs is talking about when it says things like, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. Walk with those who see the world through hope and faith, and that will shape our outlook. Walk with those who see the world through cynicism, and cynicism will color our world too. There's a show that I really enjoy called Brain Games. I don't know if you've ever seen this show. But in the show, they do these different demonstrations, they do these videos, and to demonstrate different aspects of how our brain works. And they have this great little video that gets at this idea of how we are formed through social relationships. And they just to kind of set it up a little bit, they put this woman in a waiting room. And she's there for what she thinks is an eye doctor appointment. And everyone else in the waiting room is actors except for her. Have a look at this video.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do?
Stands up.
She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there.
Not only does she stand up, she continues to do it after everyone else has left the room. And I didn't show it for time, but if you keep watching, they actually start to bring other people into the room that are not in on it, like other people like her that are just kind of there for an appointment to see what will happen if they bring other people, unwitting people into the room. And she not only continues to stand, but other people who come in see her stand, and they can start adopting the behavior. And the whole room is then filled with new people who don't know why they were standing with the beep, now standing every time, standing and sitting down every time the beep goes off. But and think about that. This is the influence. This is the influence of a group of strangers, right? They don't even know each other. And it's funny because the first person that comes in. When the woman is alone, asks her, like, why are you doing this? And she says, I don't know. They were doing it when I came in, so I just did it. And then that guy doesn't ask any more questions and just starts standing with her. And this is strangers, right? So imagine the influence of people whose opinions that we actually value, right? Whose opinions that we actually trust. The bottom line is that even in adulthood, our peer group sets a baseline for us for what we consider to be normal and achievable in terms of things like health and our habits and our lifestyle. And this slow pull of friends' influence is so ordinary, so everyday, that we rarely notice it until one day we look in the mirror and we don't see not just ourselves, but the reflection of the people that we've been walking with. So, knowing then that friendships are going to form us, the question is, are we going to be intentional about how we form them? Just because we know that friendships are going to have a formative impact on us, it doesn't mean that we're powerless. It doesn't mean that we're powerless to have any control over what that impact looks like in our lives. That's why the book of Proverbs tells us in Proverbs chapter 12, the righteous choose their friends carefully, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. We have the ability to choose friends. We have the ability, and we also have the ability to choose the way in which we navigate and prioritize friendships in our lives. And these are ways that we can be intentional about the ways that friendships form us. And it's also how we can be intentional about the ways that we act as a friend in other people's lives to be a formative presence in their lives. We can think about it in two ways: choosing friends well, and then choosing to be the kind of friend who forms well in other people's lives. First, let's talk about choosing friends well. And this isn't about like passing out applications, running background checks, doing interviews, collecting references, things like that. But it is about paying attention over time. Because we all think about how you formed friendships in your life. If you're like me, you kind of drift, right? You just kind of drift into friendships without much thought. But Proverbs invites us to be deliberate. And a lot of it comes down to observing patterns. What kind of character does a person display? And when I spend time with the person, what kind of character do I walk away stirred to display? Do I walk away stirred to what is good? Or am I nudged towards compromise? Am I growing in faith and hope and love? Or am I growing in cynicism and fear and self-centeredness? And choosing friends well, it doesn't necessarily mean cutting people out of our lives and ending friendships, although sometimes that might be the case. If you're in a friendship that's actively harmful to you, or you're in a situation of abuse and things like that, you should definitely prioritize your safety. You should talk to myself or one of the elders, talk to somebody about that. But it doesn't necessarily mean you're cutting somebody out of your life, but it may mean adjusting the level of influence we allow certain people to have in our lives. And we can be friendly toward many people, but we don't have to let everybody set the direction of our lives. Think of it like kind of like if you were choosing a hiking partner. You might enjoy, talking to somebody in the parking lot, but if they have a track record of kind of wandering off the path, and you turn around and they're kind of not next to you anymore and you don't know where they went, they're probably not the person that you might want to be okay walking with them on a nice paved path. They're probably not the person you'd want like guiding you along on a very dangerous, treacherous hike, right? But here's an important caveat, though. This is not just simply an excuse to avoid people just because they might be difficult to love or difficult or require more effort to be around. Proverbs calls us to wisdom in choosing close friends, but all of Scripture calls us to love even people that might be hard to love. Choosing friends wisely isn't about self-protection and surrounding ourselves only with people who are easy and comfortable. It's about recognizing who has shaping influence in our lives while still showing Christ-like love to all people. So choosing friends well. Secondly, we want to be the kind of friend who forms well, who has a positive, formative influence in other people's lives. So if friendships shape others, then we can't only be thinking about who shapes us. We have to ask ourselves, what is it like to be my friend? What is it like for somebody to be on the other side of me? Do I leave people encouraged in their walk with Christ? Do I challenge them in an appropriate way when they need it? Do I create an environment where people feel safe to be honest, maybe, but also inspired to grow? And we do this by being reliable and being consistent in our character and willing to go deeper than surface level conversations. We do it by initiating spiritual conversations and being willing to pray together and taking a genuine interest in the details of each other's lives. If I want to be shaped by wise friends, I also need to be the kind of friend whose presence draws other people to wisdom. Because the truth is, we're never just passive recipients of friendship. We're always, whether consciously or not, making choices about who gets close to us and how we show up in their lives. And those choices will set the trajectory of our own formation and the formation of the people that we care about. So, at this point, there may be some thinking that, you're hearing all this and you're thinking like, all right, this all sounds great, but I don't necessarily have lots of friends to choose from. It sounds great to be like, picking and choosing, or like, showing wisdom with friendship, but really, I just don't want to be lonely. I just want friends. And I don't want to be lonely. And if that's you, I say this. Number one, you're not broken. And you're not alone in feeling that way, for sure. And certainly some of the godliest men and women that we read about in Scripture wrestled with loneliness. We read about Elijah, who sat under a tree all by himself and said, was ready to God, I've had enough, was praying for God to take his life. David poured out his heart in the Psalms again and again, saying things like, turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. But loneliness is not the whole story. And Psalm 68 tells us that God sets the lonely in families. And that means that God has not forgotten you. He places his people in community. And sometimes it doesn't look exactly like the kinds of friendships that we hope for in the moment, but he doesn't leave his children without family. And that's why church matters so much. We're not just acquaintances. We're not meant to just be acquaintances who just see each other on Sundays. We're meant to be people. We're meant to be brothers and sisters in Christ who live our lives together. And even if you don't feel like you have a wide circle of friends to pick from, Proverbs wisdom still applies. We can still ask, am I putting myself in spaces where friendships can grow? Am I leaning into the Christian community that God has already given me? Am I practicing the kind of reliability and honesty and care that I long for in a friendship? And perhaps you're doing these things and it's still taking longer than you'd hoped for. And the truth is sometimes friendships do take longer than we want. And sometimes they show up in surprising places. And sometimes the step of wisdom is simply not withdrawing, even when it would be easier, because you trust that God's at work even in ways that you can't yet see. The encouragement is this: if you feel lonely, you're not outside of God's care. He sees you, he knows your ache, and he is the God who brings his people into families. And as we continue to pursue these friendships, if they're going to shape us, and they will, then the real question then becomes, what is shaping the way we see friendship in the first place? And many of us probably at some point in our lives have had that one friend who sets the bar for all the others. And you might know what I mean. Like every other friend you've had since, you kind of measured them, maybe not consciously, but maybe unconsciously, you measure them against that person. And if we're going to let wisdom shape our view of friendship instead of letting friendship shape our view of wisdom, then that measuring stick friend has to be Jesus. He's the one who sets the standard, and when he does, it changes how we choose friends and how we show up as a friend. And I know that might feel like, that's kind of like a Sunday school answer, Eric. Like, oh, Jesus is my best friend. But in Jesus, we find the ultimate fulfillment of the wisdom we read about in Proverbs pertaining to friendship. As we read verses like in Proverbs 18, one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And in Proverbs 17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. We have to think about friendship with Jesus the way he describes it. He's not just like my buddy. He's also my Lord and Master, yet he chooses to call me his friend. So John 15, we read these words of Jesus. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. So in this friend and master relationship, he is the friend that takes precedence and priority over all other friendships. Now, you could hear that, and it's easy as like a follower of Jesus to think, all right, so I feel like this really devalues all of my other friends. So all of my other friendships in my life are always just meant to take like the second place role to Jesus in my life. Or if you're here and you're not a believer, you might hear that and think, so if I am friends with a Christian, friends with a follower of Jesus, I'm always going to take a back seat in their life in priority to Jesus. Even if they're my best friend, I'm always going to take a back seat in their life. That doesn't feel very good as a friend. But I think we only feel that way if we don't really understand what it means for Jesus to be the friend that defines friendship. Because here's the thing, putting Jesus first doesn't downgrade other people in our lives. It actually makes us better friends to everyone else in our life. Because when we're following, what we do when we put Jesus in that place is we are following his pattern of friendship in all of the other friendships in our lives. When we read verses like in 1 John 4, we love because Jesus first loved us. And Jesus is calling us to love in the way that he loved us. He's upgrading the way that we are to love all of the other friends in our lives. And just like as he says in John 15, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. This is the way to be a good friend. When we put Jesus in that spot, he defines the way we are in every other friendship in our life. It doesn't downgrade all of our other friendships. It upgrades all of our other friendships. When Jesus is our truest friend, you're no longer desperate for approval, so you can freely love and accept people. You're no longer chasing your own identity, so you can speak truth into others' lives with love and without insecurity. And if you're no longer afraid of rejection, you can risk honesty and you can show grace. Because of Jesus, you get to bring wisdom and stability and truth and selflessness into your friendships, not because of how great you are, but because of everything that he has done for you. So if wisdom will form our friendships, or friendships will form our wisdom, then letting Jesus define friendship means measuring all of our other friendships against him, asking, does this relationship reflect his kind of love? Showing up in our friends' lives the way he shows up for us, with consistency, truth, grace, and sacrifice, letting his voice be the loudest in shaping how we view people, how we handle conflict, how we invest in others. And this only happens if it doesn't happen just by saying, okay, Jesus, you're my best friend, and we move him into a spot on a list. It happens by spending that time with him and prioritizing time with him. Because remember, we become like our friends when we are spending time with our friends. When the friend who laid down his life for us sets the pattern, Our friendships won't just be about us. They'll become the places where Christ's love is experienced and wisdom is shared and people are drawn closer to him. And if friendships are going to form us, and they will, then the wisest thing that we can do is let the truest friends set the pattern. That means Jesus isn't just one more friend on the list. He's the friend by which we measure all of our other friendships. And when his love defines how we relate to people, our friendships stop being about what we can get from them and start becoming places where grace and truth and encouragement are lived out. And we're not just blindly absorbing influence from others. We're intentionally bringing influence of Jesus into relationships. And I think there's no better place to close than with Jesus' own words about friendship from John 15. Jesus says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, so that you might go and bear fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love each other." That's the friendship that shapes us. That's the friendship that gives us wisdom to choose to love well and to be the kind of friend others truly need. Would you pray with me?